This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Koren Publishers. Check out their website for some amazing Chanukah deals, including the Noe edition, Hebrew English starting at just $1,000, or visit your local Jewish bookstore for 25% off all books from Koren. That's www.korenpub.com. That's KORENPUB.com for some amazing special offers for Chanukah. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Malka Simkovich, who is the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and Director of Catholic Jewish Studies at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. She's the author of Discovering Second Temple Literature and I think another book as well. And we'll be discussing on this episode of the podcast Chanukah in general and sources on Chanukah, Maccabees 1, 2, Josephus, obviously Chazal and other things. So thank you, Professor Simkovich, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
I would be glad to. I'm from Philadelphia. I am from Orthodox and somehow fell into the world of Catholic graduate studies. I am a professor of Jewish studies at Catholic Theological Union on the south end of Chicago, where I am the only Jew on campus, the only Jew on faculty, and for most of my students, the first Jew that they have ever met. So half of my work is in early Judaism, and I study the Second Temple period, and half of my work is in interfaith dialogue, which I have no training for.
So interesting. So I want to ask you two things before we even get to the Chanukah part. I had mentioned you before we started recording. I mentioned I had said I posted on my WhatsApp status. I'm doing a podcast about this, and someone asked who the guest is, and I said, "Oh, you know who you are," and I said, "Oh, Catholic school. What's going on?" So how did you end up in? I'm sure you have this question. How did you end up in this Catholic university?
I had no expectation that this would be my career path, and like I said, no interfaith training, no training in theology. I went to Stern and wanted to get a PhD in Tanakh. Note that I did not say Hebrew Bible or Old Testament because it was very much Tanakh for me. And I thought, I'll make Aliyah and I'll teach Tanakh at seminary or if I'm lucky, college. But what ended up happening is that after Stern, I went to Harvard, which is not like a place where you learn Tanakh. It's a place where you learn the Hebrew Bible. And I received a master's in Hebrew Bible. And there I realized that I was going to study the Second Temple period. I sort of fell in love with Second Temple literature. I felt like the study of Hebrew Bible is very, very important, but to say something that was both new and true felt almost impossible for me as a 21-year-old who had just left Stern. And I just encountered the world of Second Temple literature, and it was so rich and so diverse and so ignored in my own community and upbringing that I thought there's a real opportunity here to do something important and worthwhile. And so that was the beginning of my journey. I ended up getting a PhD from Brandeis in Second Temple literature. And when I finished up that PhD, I took the job at Catholic Theological Union because that was the job that was offered to me. Anybody in academia knows that it's very, very rare to have more than one offer, and a single offer is a very exciting thing. So I went in completely blind. I got this job offer and I took it. And little did I know that it would just open up a whole new world of interfaith dialogue and all kinds of other things that I'm still learning about.
Okay, interesting. So I guess maybe we'll get more to that later, how you especially with Chanukah and how you teach in the Catholic, in the school. So, let's start off like this, I think. So with Chanukah, first of all, I will mention for the listeners that I did an episode about a lot of these similar things as well last year with Professor Lawrence Schiffman, who you know well. So people can listen to that as well. But this is different. So we went through the history there. Just maybe quickly if you want to, and then we'll get the sources. I don't know how we want to do this, but the story of Chanukah from Second Temple literature, as you said, your expertise is in, and then we really should discuss a lot of the sources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in terms of the Second Temple period, everybody knows about the books of the Maccabees. There's 1 Maccabees, there's 2 Maccabees. There's also 3 Maccabees and 4 Maccabees, but they don't really have anything to do with the story of Chanukah. So we have 2 books of Maccabees. We have Josephus, which is actually fascinating because he is quite confused himself about the origins of Chanukah and doesn't have all the answers for his readers. And we have 2 very short letters that are appended, that are added to the book of 2 Maccabees, that were written by Jews in Judea to Jews living in Egypt, asking them to keep Chanukah. And those really are the earliest sources that we have for Chanukah. Those are dated to the late 2nd century BCE. I mean, really fascinating letters that very few people know about. But when you put it all together, we have very little from the Second Temple period. And likewise, of course, from the rabbinic period. We have the famous passage, My Chanukah and Shabbat, and we have a couple other short, brief passages. But when you put it all together, again, it's a very short list.
Right now, okay, so what are those letters? I mean, tell the listeners, what do those letters say that you're saying those are the oldest ones that we have?
Yeah, so what's really amazing about these letters is that they're dated. They're dated from the beginning of the Seleucid period. So one letter dates itself to 188, which is actually, if you subtract it from 323 BCE, you actually get the date for this letter, which I think is I'm bad at math, but it's the late 2nd century BCE. So these letters suggest that Chanukah was a kind of canvas upon which Judean Jews could sort of sort out their relationship with diasporan Jews by saying, look, this really important thing happened, and you as diasporan Jews have a stake in this story. So if anybody can look up 2 Maccabees, you can find it online, it's on the public domain. But if you look up the first 9 verses of 2 Maccabees, it's actually not part of the book 2 Maccabees. It's a letter. So it opens up, I'm just looking at it now, the Jews in Jerusalem and those in the land of Judea, writing to their Jewish kindred in Egypt, greetings and true peace. And the way this opens up suggests that it was written in Hebrew, possibly Aramaic, definitely a Semitic language. And they say, may God do good to you. May he remember his covenant with Abraham, with Yitzchak, with Yaakov. So it's quite a beautiful letter, a very pious letter. May God give you a heart to worship him and to do his will with a strong heart. And then it goes on and on and on, this long bracha, you might say. And then it says, please see to it that you keep the festival of booths in the month of Kislev. The festival of booths in the month of Kislev. And then it dates itself in the 188th year. And I just figured out that would be around 124 BCE. So you have this fascinating Sukkot and Kislev situation, which we're all familiar with. I mean, we know that this is also how it's presented in the books of the Maccabees themselves, that when the temple was restored and dedicated that year, they hadn't celebrated Sukkot in the temple. So, of course, they just pushed it off to the winter. But there seems to be more going on there in the letter. Why do they care so much about Chanukah? Why do they have to write to random Jews in Egypt? You need to keep this holiday. So it's fascinating. And in fact, there's a second letter that's added to 2 Maccabees that essentially does the same thing, but it's even more elaborate. And that's dated to around 102 BCE.
Now, I just want to clarify one thing here for the listeners. You said everyone may be familiar with 1 and 2 Maccabees, just in case they're not, because not necessarily everyone listening to this is. What is 1 and 2? Are they 1 and 2? Or are they 2 separate books? I mean, who wrote them? Just talk a little bit about them, just before we get back to the letters, so maybe the listeners can know what they are.
Fair point. They're actually very, very different. 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees, and they get a bad reputation in the frum community. Oh, that's apocrypha. That's Hellenized. That's not part of our tradition. It's not in the Tanakh, and it's not cited by the rabbis. What is this? And why should we care? But these are very important texts, and they were both written by very pious Jews. But they're different. 1 Maccabees was written originally in Hebrew, in Judea, by a member of the Hasmonean, the Hashmona'i court, who's really focused on legitimizing the Hashmona'i family. So the focus of 1 Maccabees is look at these heroes. This is a pietistic family. These are spiritual, religious role models, and almost like the biblical heroes, perfect in every way. And there is a reason for this polemic. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, the family is not doing too well. There is a decline in the Hashmona'i family. And then, of course, we have these famous villains in the family like Alexander Yanai and others. So it's not a great situation when the writer is putting this work together. There's a real polemic to promote the piety of the family. 2 Maccabees cares a lot less about the family. It was written for sure in Greek. It was written for sure outside of Judea. And so you might say, well, 2 Maccabees, that's, maybe it's less reliable or it's less relevant. But 2 Maccabees is very relevant because it's the first interpretation of events. It's not just about the events themselves, but it theologizes the events. So the Greek-speaking writer of 2 Maccabees is super anti-Hellenism. And this is the first work ever to use the word Judaism in Greek. Like that word doesn't exist. Judaism, Judaismos, it's not a word. It's invented by the author of 2 Maccabees. And he uses it as a contrast to Hellenismos. So the idea that is very pervasive in our Frum community, which is that Judaism is in imminent opposition with Hellenism, derives from a 2nd century BCE text that was written in Greek in the diaspora. So it's a very important work because it's working hard to understand these events in a theological way. So 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees, they have different angles, but they complement each other in meaningful ways.
I want to pick up on something that you mentioned, the Maccabeum, and it's the rap that it gets in the Frum community. So I was telling this to before, and I said this on last year's podcast with Professor Schiffman as well. There is a critical yeshivish, whatever you want to call it, what's the right word, version of Maccabeum Aleph that came out. It's Suf Publishers, and it was edited by Levi Yitzchak Haritin. Based on, he's using the translation to Lashon Kodesh, from in Hebrew, from the Greek, from Kahana. And it's with extensive footnotes, pictures, maps. And yes, he defends it, in reading it exactly. So that I was just in this farm store. It's there. It's around $20-something. So anyone can get it. Only one, I think he's supposed to be working on 2, but I don't think it came out. So if anybody, as far as I know, so that's just, I'll just mention that over there with that. Okay. So now getting back to 2, but what you were saying about 1 and 2, this obviously, I don't know what the answer to that. I'll just ask the question. What is more important? Is there one or 2 that's more important for us, knowing historical facts, or they're both?
Well, I think that maybe 2 Maccabees is more influential for how we retell the story of Chanukah. So it's not only that there's this Judaism versus Hellenism, but there are certain features of the book that we don't find in 1 Maccabees. So for example, there are miracles in 2 Maccabees. Now they're not the miracle of the oil, but there are other miracles. And the writer is very explicit that these are miraculous events. So, for example, there's this general named Heliodorus who comes at the beginning of the book to Jerusalem and wants to invade the Jerusalem treasury and take all the money from the temple treasury. And this is obviously a very stressful thing for the Jewish people. They cry, they pray, they go into mourning because Heliodorus is coming to empty the temple treasury. And then a miracle happens. Angels show up and they essentially beat Heliodorus up and he runs away. It's an incredible passage and it's presented as a miracle. And that's not the only miracle in 2 Maccabees. So 1 Maccabees is trying to present an archival history. I'm not saying it's objective, but it's really trying to promote the Hashmonai family. But 2 Maccabees, there's a real theology, and I think it's very influential. And in fact, in 2 Maccabees chapter 6, there's a whole theology that's articulated by the writer where he says, don't think that the suffering of the Jewish people means that God has abandoned us. Oh, it's the end of chapter 5. He says that God causes the Jewish people to suffer because he loves them so much. And if they don't suffer in this life, then they'll suffer more in the world to come. So that's very rare to have such developed theological ideas in the Second Temple period. And the other reason why 2 Maccabees is important is because the climactic scene of the book is the story of the mother of the 7 sons. She's not identified as Hannah. That comes much later. But this is the story that's at the heart of the holiday. It's considered it is so moving, so influential. It was circulated in many, many communities, and we find it in writing first in 2 Maccabees.
You want to say the story?
Sure, I could say the story. And I could tell you a wacky theory that you'll probably disagree with me about. But first I'll say the story, and then I'll say my theory. 2 Maccabees chapter 7. This is the story of the mother of the 7 sons, where there's so many fascinating details in the story, but basically the king confronts these children and he says, you have to you have to violate your ancestral laws. You have to break kashrut and you have to eat pork or whatever. And one by one, the brothers each defy him and they're tortured in different ways. And so it's very Hellenist in the sense that you have these elaborate tortures, but it's also very Frum because the whole point is that they're not going to break dietary laws. They're not going to break the laws of kashrut, however they understood it. But there's a few interesting details in the story. One is that the mother encourages the children to martyr themselves, and she does so by whispering into their ear in Hebrew. So they're speaking Greek to the king, but if you look at 2 Maccabees chapter 7, verse 27, she leans close to one of her sons and speaks to them in their native language and says, "My son, I carried you 9 months in my womb. I nursed you for 3 years. I reared you. I beg you, my child, look at the heaven and earth and see everything that is in them and recognize that God did not make them out of things that existed." Like, what is this? It's like philosophy that's embedded in the story. But she's speaking to them, this like form of like Greek Jewish philosophy in Hebrew. I mean, it's an incredible scene. So they all go one by one before the king. They all refuse to eat pork. They refuse to break their Jewish laws, and they're killed. And the most elaborate murder comes at the end of the chapter when one of the sons is killed by being fried in oil in a frying pan, essentially. I'm looking for the verses now. Where is that? I can't find it, but he's basically fried to death. And I wonder, again, this is my wacky theory, whether this might have something to do with our interest in oil and also fried food. I think that there's something. Okay, maybe it's taking it too far, but I'm very interested by this imagery, and clearly Jews in the Second Temple period were as well.
Now another. Well, you mentioned the letters. I mean, you did you finish discussing the second letter there that's appended, or no? Want to go back?
I think, but it would take us a long time to really do justice to the letter. It's really fascinating, and I don't know if you want to spend so much time on it, but you have a few minutes to talk about this letter.
Okay.
So this is a different letter from a different group of people because we know that it's dated to a different year. And so this letter, so the first one is dated to around 124. The second one is dated to around 103 or 102. And so again, we have an opening. Yeah, sorry, Nachi. Yeah.
Do you want to orient people? So what when you say like 102, 103, 120, when are we talking about? I guess give them some sort of maybe Jewish, like where are we holding that people can understand where this is, when this was?
Well, when I was in high school, I did learn all the like whatever it was, like 372. I don't remember any of these years in the Hebrew calendar, so I can't share that with you. But I can say that the numbers are going down. We're approaching the year 1. There is no year 0, by the way. And so this is what we would call the late Second Temple period. We're, really under Hellenism right now. I don't know what else to say.
I mean, in regards, and this letter in regards to Chanukah, where does this?
So Chanukah. So the war begins in around 167 BC. Again, the numbers go down. The victory is about 3 years later, but the reason why I sound hesitant when I say 3 years later is because they don't really reach a sort of real stability until around 140. So there's still battles. Yes, they recover the temple and they recover the city of Jerusalem, but the conflict actually goes on for like another 25 years or so. So yes, we say that the war is 167 to 164 BCE.
Okay, so go ahead. So the letter is after that, is a bit fair, but after
that, right? So by this time, there's like a clear Judean monarchy that is independent from Rome. That doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory, because it's also a time where there's conflict in Judea of like, are we going to adhere to our ancestral laws and the Torah and our tradition, or are we going to Hellenize? I mean, this is the famous conflict that actually Chanukah did not resolve, because even after the story of Chanukah, Jews are still having this debate, and that never gets resolved. It really doesn't. So in this letter, again, we have leaders in Jerusalem writing Jews in Egypt, and there were probably, conservative estimate, 500,000 Jews in Egypt, which people don't know about, but Egypt was a massive epicenter of Jewish life in the Second Temple period. We know that there were even Jewish temples. Again, that doesn't sound very firm. It sounds very heretical, but the Mishnah talks about them. Chonya Onias, the high priest who had to flee the Hellenizers in the early 2nd century BC, goes to Egypt, and his followers build a temple. So again, that does sound very heretical. I get it. But the point is, there are Jews in Egypt. And the Judean community is very interested in these Jews following their lead and accepting their authority. So anyway, in the second letter, it's really interesting because there's a lot of allusion to stories from Tanakh. So the letter first starts out by talking about the miraculous death of Antiochus, but where it really gets interesting is it opens up, after it mentions the death of Antiochus, it says, on the 25th day of Kislev, we're going to celebrate the purification of the temple. So already that's different from the first letter, which talked about it as it was Sukkot. Now we're not calling it Sukkot. We thought it necessary to notify you, oh, wait a second, in order that you may celebrate the festival of booths and the festival of fire, given when Nehemiah, there's a lot going on here, offered sacrifices. So now we have like all kinds of characterizations. It's the purification of the temple holiday, or is it the festival of booth holiday, or is it the festival of fire from the time of Nehemiah holiday? And so this is a great letter because it shows us that Chanukah is in transition. It's all of that. There are Jews at this time who are still celebrating it as Sukkot, right? Like they knew that the Hashmonaim couldn't celebrate Sukkot, so it does have that Sukkot quality. But this letter also argues that there's something before the Hashmonaim family that has ancient roots. So this letter argues that the real history of Chanukah precedes the Hashmonaim. And it goes through this whole story. I'll read a little bit of it because it's very long, but listen to this. So the letter continues, when our ancestors were led captive to Persia. So this is obviously the exile. The first temple is burned. They go down into Babylonia in 586. The priests took fire from the altar and secretly hid it. So the priests at the end of the first time of the first Beis Hamikdash, they secretly hid fire and they left. They went into captivity. Many years passed. And then when it pleased God, Nehemiah was commissioned by the king of Persia, and he sent the descendants of the priests to go get the fire. So this is, again, I'm using secular dates. In 538, Persia has defeated Babylonia. They say to the Judeans in exile, you can go back, rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. They do that. And then Nehemiah says, oh, I remember that there was fire hidden from the first Beis Hamikdash. Let's go find it. Anyway, they find this liquid from the fire that had been put away in some cave secretly. They build an altar in Judea. They pour the liquid on top, and what happens? A miracle. So the letter continues and says that they sprinkled the liquid on wood. They laid things upon it. Some time passed, and then a great fire blazed up so that all marveled. And while the sacrifice was consumed, the priests offered prayer. And then a priest named Yonatan utters this beautiful prayer. Anyway, it's just a stunning letter. And the whole point of it is that the Judean Jews are saying, look, this holiday that we're celebrating, it's not just about us. It's not just about the Hashmonaim in Judea. It has nothing to do with you. It's actually about the Jewish people and the fact that God wants you to come home. And we know that God wants you to come home because when Nehemiah's generation went back to Judea, God made a miracle for them. And that tells us that whatever happened to the Hashmonaim, there's a pattern here of God doing miracles for those who come home. So if you come home, God will do a miracle for you. And so this is like a fascinating way to frame Chanukah as something that like is meant to convince diasporan Jews, like, come back, it'll be okay. Don't worry, God will do miracles for you. He did miracles for Nehemiah, he did miracles for the Maccabees, and he'll do miracles for you.
Fascinating. And these letters, like you're saying, they're not part of two Maccabees, Maccabean Bays. They're appended. They're added on.
They were probably added on in the first century BCE.
And where can listeners find these? These are online. Where can someone find these letters?
You can go into any public domain. So if you go to the website that I use, but again, it's not a particularly Jewish website, but if you go to bible.oremus, oremus.org, this is where I just put in one Maccabees and then the whole thing pops up. I don't know who runs these websites, so I can't vouch for them, but it's very easy to find them online.
Right. Okay. So before we get into, we'll discuss, obviously you've already been alluding to it with Chazal, with the Nes Pach Shemen, which everyone knows, with the oil, with the menorah. So before we get there, I think a couple other sources that we should mention is number one, Josephus they alluded to, and also I guess Megillus Tainus is one just quickly worth mentioning. Those two, we should probably mention what they have to say about Chanukah, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Josephus has some pretty interesting things to say about Chanukah. So Josephus, he writes four things. He writes an autobiography. He writes a defense of the Jewish religion called Against Apion. He writes a 7-volume work that describes the events of the Jewish rebellion against Rome, the Jewish war. And he writes a 20-volume work of Jewish history, starting from the beginning of Bereshit. And this work is known as Antiquities of the Jews. So when he gets to the 2nd century BCE, because again, this is like a massive work, he gets to the 2nd century BCE in book 12 of Antiquities out of 20. And he tells the whole story, and he definitely has sources. He might have one Maccabees. He might have sources that are lost to us. He retells the story in a very elaborate way. He has all the details pretty much nailed down, very, very close to what we see in 1 Maccabees. But what's interesting about Josephus is that he doesn't have clarity on everything. So he knows that, and again, he's running about 90 CE at the very end of the 1st century. And he knows that by this time, it's called the Festival of Lights, but he doesn't know why. So I'm just going to read you a little bit from Antiquities, book 12, paragraph 7, line 7. He says, the people were so very glad at the revival of their customs, when after a long time of intermission, they regained freedom of their worship. He's a beautiful writer. And they made it a law for their posterity that they should keep a festival on account of the restoration for 8 days. And then he gets a little confused. He's like, well, and from that time to this, we celebrate this festival and we call it lights. And then he's like, honestly, and this is so great because Josephus is not a modest man. But here he's like, I have no clue. So he goes, I suppose the reason was because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us. And then that thence was the name given to the festival. He's like, I guess light is like allegorical because we were in like figurative darkness. And then there was a miracle. Like he does not know. He doesn't have the tradition that we find in the letters appended to Maccabees about a miraculous fire. He's like, lights, I don't know, liberty beyond our hopes. He's like allegorizing it. I think he's like flailing a little bit in that passage.
But what's interesting is clearly he knows there is already a tradition at that time. So it doesn't say they were lighting a menorah, right? But he knows that there's a light. He knows that that's really interesting. There was something going on about this for sure.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what's great about it is that if he knows it's called lights, but he doesn't know why, that tells you that there's something ancient, right? Like once it's passed down and passed down and passed down. So he lost the meaning. That happens a lot of times where you do something, but you don't know like the original reason for it. So by the end of the 1st century, some connection there was very, very strong and ancient.
Right. And we should point out that Josephus is not Josephus. Josephus is 2 different works.
It's true. That's true. And when I talk about Josephus, a lot of times when I'm speaking about him in shuls or whatever, people really don't like him. They think, oh, I know Josephus. He was a traitor against the Jewish people. Everything he says is garbage. I don't have to listen to anything, totally invalidated. So I disagree. I think Josephus is a very, very important witness to what Jewish life was like in the late Second Temple period. He really risks his position in Rome to defend the integrity of the Jewish people. So I think we should give Josephus credit for that because he was financially dependent on the Flavian dynasty. So he could have bashed the Jewish people, but he actually defends the Jewish religion. So we got to be careful with Josephus.
Yeah, but right, it's good to say. I will point out. I don't remember. I think I've said this at least once on the podcast. The listeners will know more than me. But Rashi and the Valley Taisus quote Yosifun, but clearly thinking it's Josephus, and they give it credence thinking it's Josephus. So obviously they had no problem using this kind of, even though it wasn't. But it comes from Josephus, and they thought it was Josephus. Just throwing that out there.
Right. Right. That's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Part of the problem is that Josephus was of interest to Christians. And so the people who were copying his work were Christians. So at a certain point, it's natural for the Jewish community to be like, well, he's not part of our tradition. But that's not totally true. So anyway, I think that passage is really interesting because it does point to something mysterious that has to do with light, but we don't exactly know what from Josephus.
Now, okay, so then we, it's mentioned in Megillus Tainus, and then we get to Chazal, really, we get to the Gemara, and obviously the Mishnah doesn't mention Chanukah, and then we get to the Gemara, the famous Gemara in Shabbos, and we get to the Nes Pach Shemen, we get to the oil, everybody knows, the menorah, the whole story. So I guess there's 2 questions. I know you have an article you've written about this. Why the Mishnah doesn't mention it? The Gemara has, suddenly we get there's 2 aspects. Let's go with the first aspect. Why do Chazal don't play up the part that's for sure played up in 1 Maccabees, I think 2 also, right? The whole the military aspect, the aspect that they won the war, that they overcame, that they won. That whole part is really downplayed. It is mentioned in the Gemara. It's like off, but it's not really. I mean, why is that?
Well, I'm not going to give you a very innovative answer. This is the classic answer, but I think it's the right one, which is the rabbis are very uncomfortable with militarism. They've suffered extraordinary loss. There are 3 Jewish rebellions. There's the one in 70, but really it's a 7-year war that starts in 66 and ends in 73. It's a long war, obviously devastating because of the fall of the Beis Hamikdash and the thousands and thousands of casualties, the captives that are brought to Rome. It's horrible trauma. But that's not the end of the story with Rome. There's another rebellion that starts up in the diaspora and maybe spreads to Judea. That's in 115. That lasts for 3 years. So that's another, what you would call Jewish war. And then, of course, most famously, Bar Kokhba, that begins in 132, ends in 135. And that maybe is even the biggest trauma of all, because with that, Hadrian essentially, kicks the Jews out of Yerushalayim and says, I'm done. This is just there. It's clear by then that there isn't going to be a third Beis Hamikdash. It's clear. The rabbis move up north, and that's sort of the end of it. They give up this messianic, this hope for independence that is so tied up with their messianic expectations. And so by the time you get to the 2nd century, the rabbis are like, we're done. We daven for Mashiach, we hope for a restoration, but we're not going to rebel against the Roman Empire. That is not what we're going to do. And so to glorify a rebellion could give false hope to those generations of Jews who are suffering under the Roman Empire. And that's certainly not what the rabbis want to do. And then, of course, there's the bigger question of why would you celebrate a holiday based on a war? Let's interpret that in a way which can remind us of God's everlasting commitment to the covenantal relationship that he has with the Jewish people. That's much more transcendent than a war. So, for all of those reasons, again, I'm not saying anything new, but I do think that this is just the boring and correct answer. The rabbis attribute theological meaning, but they're not the first two, right? We saw it in 2 Maccabees. We see hints of it in Josephus. We see that Jews are doing this from the very beginning.
So what you're saying is that people come down sometimes say, oh, Chazal just made it up. It's not mentioned anywhere else. You're saying, no, it is mentioned. And maybe they, like you said, Josephus didn't know the reason, but Chazal's saying, oh, here we have the reason. There definitely was, we see hints of it earlier for sure as well.
Yeah, and Jews are talking about miracles in the 2nd century BC. So whether it is the Nes Pach Shemen or whether it's another miracle, there is this association between God sort of intervening into the affairs of these people, the Jews, but also specifically the Hashmonai family. And so this is almost contemporaneous with the story of Chanukah itself, meaning as soon as people are talking about this, they're talking about miracles, and maybe not only the Nes Pach Shemen or maybe a different miracle, but the idea that God intervened miraculously and this association with light, it's very early. And I think many people don't realize that.
Right. I mean, it's very interesting. So, and I would say that the definitely, the whole military aspect, the whole rebellion aspect. I mean, that was a big, massive miracle. I mean, in Bimei Matisyo, what we have, it is played up over there. When you read that, they definitely over there, it is played up.
So that's really interesting that there seems to be some sort of return in the late rabbinic period to acknowledging the military aspect. If you read Al Hanisim, it's really not only focused on the miracle. If you read Al Hanisim, you're like, well, this is actually a very interesting combination of the military aspect with the miraculous aspect. But let's say Al Hanisim, hard to date. But let's say, late rabbinic, 7th century. I don't know that I'm not like a scholar in dating liturgy, but it's not Tanaitic, right? It's not that early. And so we can conclude that at a certain point in time, the rabbis were comfortable talking about the military aspect bracketed within this miraculous context. Look at the miracles that God did for us. There was a miracle of the oil and there was a miracle of victory. And the truth is, it is miraculous. I mean, think about Judea vis-a-vis this massive behemoth of the Syrian Greeks. It doesn't make sense. Scholars don't really have a way of explaining this. How could they have defeated this, one of the most powerful people in the known world? I don't know. I can't tell you. Nobody really can, because it's just bizarre. It's like a historical anomaly.
Let me ask you about another source that we didn't mention, because it's not a source of Chanukah as we know it, about all that we've been discussing. but it's related to Hanukkah. Because the book of Yehudis, of Judith, is one that everyone seems to know somewhat about Hanukkah. Maybe they know the story, maybe they don't know the story. So let me ask you a two-part question. First of all, the listeners that maybe are somewhat familiar or not really familiar, what is the story? And then I'll leave. Then we afterwards we can pick up and think, what does this have to do with Hanukkah?
It's a great story. So I'm going to call her Judith, but obviously this is Yehudit, and she is associated with the holiday of Hanukkah quite late in the medieval period. However, scholars date the book that, first of all, they argue that this was a book written in Hebrew, in Judea, in the 2nd century BCE, all of which suggests, assuming it's post-war, that this was written by someone who was very, very familiar with the events of the Hashmonaite rebellion. But the story itself is fascinating. And before I talk about it, I want to give you my interpretation of it, which is I think that this story is a subversive story of Judah Maccabee himself. In other words, Yehudit, Yehudah, right? She has armor, which is her beauty. He has armor, which is his armor. There are all kinds of parallels between Judith and Judah that really suggest to me that this was a story meant to entertain, but also meant to convey, meant to be an entertaining version of the Hashmonai story that wouldn't have been risky to circulate, right? So it would have been risky to be writing and circulating these books that promoted what would have been considered by the Greeks to be dangerous traitors. But the story of Judith doesn't have, any sort of immediate historical connection to the story. But I do think that there's a very, very deep connection there. So Judith saves the people of Betulia, and I don't have to say what Betulia means. You know enough Hebrew to know, but the town does not exist. Okay, I'll just say virgin town. It doesn't exist. We don't have any evidence of this, right? And there's real intentionality on the part of the author to make this story ahistorical. The enemy general is Holofernes, which is a Greek name, but the enemy king is Nebuchadnezzar, who lives in Assyria. I mean, that's like saying in the days of George Washington, when I don't know, you have to mix it up, when Harry Potter was walking his dog with I don't know, Barack Obama. It doesn't make sense. It's totally ahistorical. But if you read the first chapter of Judith and you're like, wait, Nebuchadnezzar, Holofernes, Assyria, what is the writer doing? The writer is saying, put all that history aside, listen to my theological message. It's not heretical to make a story ahistorical. It's saying, forget the history for a second. Let me teach you a lesson. Let me give you a story. Think about the meaning. Think about the theology. So Judith is this widow. She's very wealthy. She's very beautiful. She's very respected. And the city comes under siege by an enemy general who wants to punish the town for not allying with the are they Assyrians or Greeks? We don't even know. But with this powerful empire against their enemies. And so they're being punished. They're under siege. And of course, I'm not going to say of course, because many of us haven't read this inside. But while under siege, Judith bravely breaks out of the siege with her anonymous handmaiden. And the author's careful to tell us that she takes a whole bag of kosher food with her. And they break out of the siege. They go down the mountain. The enemy generals and officers at the bottom are watching her do this. And the Judean elders at the top of the mountain where the town is are watching her. And they're also captivated by her that they can't even stop her. They're helpless. That's a very Hellenist sort of detail in the story. She just waltzes out of there. And then she shows up at the bottom of the mountain. She shows up at the enemy camp. And essentially over the course of a few days, she befriends and then seduces and murders the enemy general Holofernes. But the details of the story are very pietistic. So she's very careful to keep kosher. She's very observant. The opening introduction of her character talks about how she observed Shabbat and the holidays, and she fasted when she was supposed to fast, and she did everything she's supposed to do. So all of those things that would have made you distinctively Jewish in the 2nd century BCE, she does all of that. It's a very pietistic work. And she utters a prayer at the moment that she beheads Holofernes, a very beautiful prayer. And it's just a very striking image. And then she literally this is the best part of the book, she sticks his head in the bag of food. that is a detail. Well, she wraps it in a sheet and then she puts it in the bag. I'm like, wait a second, that's where your tuna fish is. It's very confusing. But anyway, she sticks his head in her bag and then goes back to the town of Betulia and says, look, elders of Judah, look what I've done. I've saved the people. So the book ends with this beautiful song that mirrors Shoftim, Prakim Dalet and Hay, the song of Devorah. So she's a little bit of a combination of Yael and Devorah. She's militaristic, but she also has this like very sort of this, it's not just beauty, it's like incredible charisma that she has that just like people are captivated by her. So this is the story of Judith, but I do think that it reads almost parallel to the story of Judah, this iconoclast who goes against the people who are cowardly and fearful and says, no, you have to be brave, stand up for yourself, do the right thing, take those risks. And when they take those risks, they save their people.
What's the connect? Is that the connection to Chanukah? Because somehow this story has made its way into the world. People seem to, even the frum world, everyone seems to know the story somehow. It's not the type of story you would assume they do know the story. I mean, what's the connection to Chanukah? And how did it get, do you have any hypothesis how, for some reason, this is the story, everybody seems to know this story, somewhat, some version of it.
Yeah, so there I really can't help you. I mean, look, we have early medieval sources that talk about her, just like we have early medieval sources that talk about Chana, the mother of the 7 sons, and there's this sort of like connection between the story of the story of Chana and Shmuel with the mother of the 7 sons who's not named. I don't know that I have a satisfying explanation for that very good question, but this is a story that derives from the Hashmonaí context. And it's possible that Jews who were telling the story did at one point know that, even if people today don't.
And I'll mention, I have where I have it. I mean, the most accessible English, simple. There's this small book from Toby Press, which is Koran, Ancient Jewish Novels, an anthology from the Greco-Roman period, and it's in here. So it is a nice, simple English translation. There's a lot of other things in here. I'm sure you're familiar with this book, but it is in there if anybody's interested in reading the book of Judith.
Yeah, I think that was written by Larry Wills, and he's a really wonderful scholar of Second Temple Jewish literature.
Right. So that's a little, like I said, I think it's still available on their website, but as far as I know. Okay. So, I mean, that's really a lot of the sources. So, I mean, what would you recommend people who want to read more about these sources? They want to read more about Chanukah. Is it Maccabees 1, 2, Josephus? What? Do you have something else, a book that somebody wrote now? I mean, where would you suggest that they read up?
Well, I would hope that people that no one in the frum community is put off by the fact that these books are labeled as the Apocrypha, which basically means that they are canonized in the Catholic tradition. And so they're read as scriptural, authoritative texts. But at the same time, they were written by frum Jews, by God-fearing Jews who emphasize Shabbos, kashrut, who are emphasizing all the things, again, that would have made you Jewish, made you obviously observant of your Jewish ancestral laws in the ancient world. So I would start with 1 Maccabees. I would start with 2 Maccabees, knowing that they come from very different cultural contexts with different polemical objectives. I would also, likewise, I would look at Josephus, a lot of very important historical material there. But then, so what did we not mention from Chazal? So first of all, there's the famous Mai Chanukah passage from Shabbos, but there's also, did we talk about Megillah Antiochus yet?
No, we forgot to mention that. You're right. We forgot to mention Megillah Antiochus.
So this is really a fascinating text. And I would read it like 2 Maccabees in the sense that, even though it might be like 7th or 8th century, we don't know, late rabbinic, but in the sense that the writer of this text is retelling a story that is very, very familiar to him, but in a way that provides theological meaning to the story. It actually reads a lot like Esther. So the king is persecuting the Judeans because they won't assimilate, and that drives him crazy. Like, none of this is in 1 Maccabees or 2 Maccabees, but then, of course, the question is with those books, like, why is he doing this to the Jewish people? And we don't get a satisfactory answer. Like, what is, and scholars debate, like, where did this conflict come from? What was motivating? And Antiochus, who's known as Antiochus for Epiphanies, like, why was he doing this to the Judeans? There are all kinds of theories. But if you look at Megillah Antiochus, it's just clear. The king hates the Jews because they won't assimilate. I have it somewhere on my desktop, but it actually looks a lot like what Haman says to to Achashverosh, Yeshno Am Echad, Mufuzar, Mufurad, Mikol Amim. Now, I haven't compared exactly what Haman says to Achashverosh with what the king says in Megillat Antiochus, but I can guarantee you it is strikingly similar. Let's see if I could pull it up somewhere. So he says, there are people among us, the Judeans and Yehud, who do not worship our gods or observe the law. They abandon the laws of the kings in order to observe their own laws, and on and on. They say, when will our own king rule over us? When will we gain authority over both sea and land? And by the way, this is like the kind of anti-Judaism that we see today, where like those Jews, they might seem like your good neighbor, but they're just waiting to take over the world. So all of this kind of motivational material, it doesn't appear in earlier texts. So I think this is a very fascinating testament to how Jews in the rabbinic period are kind of thinking about how to theologize this work and how to understand it. And also, of course, it mentions the miracle of the oil.
Right. I was trying to find it. I think in the Siddur Eitzar Tfilos, the 2 volumes, listeners may be familiar with. I believe it's printed in there, but on the spot right now, I'm looking for it. I can't find it.
You can find it at opensiddur.org.
Oh, okay. So that there as well. So there's that as well, right? But like you said, it's probably late. Megillas Antiochus, it's probably a late written. It's not as early,
right?
So there are those. Are there any other things, or those are the main primary sources, really?
Oh, so primary. Okay, so Megillat Antiochus, and it's mentioned in Megillat Tani. There's a little interesting line in Pesikta Rabbati, which is fascinating because it combines the military aspect of the holiday with the theological aspect of the holiday. And actually, so I'll tell you what Pesikta Rabbati says, and then I'll tell you about a parallel. So Pesikta says, why do we light candles on Chanukah? Maybe the 7th or 8th century, late rabbinic. Because when the sons of the Chashmonaim, the high priest, defeated the Hellenists, they entered the temple and found 8 iron spears, and they put candles on them and they lit them. Now, if you look at the scolion, if you look at this, like append, whatever you want to call it, like the scolion, how do you define that? Like the commentary to Megillat Tani, there's a very similar image about the first Chanukah celebration, where it says the Greeks went into the temple, they defiled all the vessels, there was nothing to light. So the Chashmonaim, when they were victorious, they brought 7 skewers of iron, covered them with tin, and began to light. So this is interesting because they're not simply lighting the menorah in this tradition, but they're using weapons. They're using like these iron sort of like spears to light the menorah. And so what is this tradition doing? I think it's very interesting. It's almost like, where's in Yeshayahu that says that the weapons will be transformed into like pruning shears, and somewhere, I guess at the very beginning of Yeshayahu, I don't remember. But the point is like you do have this sort of transformation of these military, these weapons, and they're sort of co-opted into this image of the menorah, which I think is fascinating. But yeah, so what is that? What is that in total? So 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, Josephus, the letters, of course, Megillat Tani, Shabbat, Megillat Antiochus, Pesikta Rabbati. I mean, look, yeah, this is a nice list, Al Hanisim. And then, of course, my book. And then you're good. That's it. That's all you need.
And to be clear for the listeners, your book is not about Chanukah. It's about overall, as you call it, discovering Second Temple literature. It's about overall, right? The whole
right.
wide time period.
Yeah. So my book does cover Second Temple Jewish history, but it is not just about Chanukah. That's correct.
It's more of a broad view, right?
Yes, definitely.
Right. There aren't really any specific books about Chanukah like this, right? Not exactly.
You know, since you mention it, it does surprise me that I don't know of any books that really use those primary texts to put something together, like a sort of scholarly analysis of how Chanukah was retold and understood and interpreted. Like, I don't know of anything. I mean, I could tell you great scholars of the Second Temple period, like Lauren Schiffman or Shia Cohen. They're great scholars, but what you're describing, I don't know of any.
Right. Yeah, listen, I did a podcast episode, like I said, at the end of a year, I'll mention again, I did with Professor Schiffman last year. We did this one this year. So we have two different, different takes on a lot of the same stuff. Right. Exactly. But books, I mean, go back and read the sources. Everyone can check that out. And that's about it. Okay. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. My pleasure. Thank you. I appreciate it.
No, it was a pleasure. Thanks a lot. And happy Chanukah.
Yes.